Welcome to another Founder Wisdom podcast. We have Dan J. Levi with us. He's into strategic storytelling that wins hearts and markets. His company is called Storyline. He's founded that since a couple of months now, but it's not his first company. So, Dan, I'm glad to have you on. Tell us a bit more about yourself and what you're up to nowadays.
Yeah, great to be here, Charles. I help companies at pivotal moments of growth and transformation uncover their story, craft their story, and bring their story to market. What do I mean by story? I mean really the overarching story that communicates what they do, why it matters, how it's different, and really why it matters now. A story that's rooted in the current context of their market and their problem space, a story that's differentiated, and a story that ultimately, as you said, wins hearts and markets.
Interesting. And why is storytelling even more important now in the age of AI?
Yeah, so AI has, I think, lifted the floor and raised and lowered the barrier to entry when it comes to everything from product development to go to market, to some extent to storytelling. But the other thing that it's done is that it's made everybody sound exactly the same, right? To be honest, this was happening before AI, but AI has only made it worse, right? In any given market, in any given industry, people are using the same words, the same jargon, to talk about what they do. And it's super confusing for buyers. And it's just become harder and harder for companies to differentiate in these really crowded and frankly confusing market spaces. So story, I think, is really the only way to differentiate and to ultimately, rise above the sea of sameness, as I like to say, and really, make sure that you're capturing the right buyer, at the right time.
Right. And is the first step of storytelling like living a great story and taking risks and actually being adventurous?
It could be. I mean, I believe in a bold story, right. A story that's a story that's bold, that's opinionated, that's rooted in your point of view and your perspective. So depending on where you've come from and your market space, right, that could be about taking risks. That could be a little bit more edgy. Or not. I think maybe what you're talking about a little bit is the founder story, right? Like a founder story is often very much about them and their background, like how they landed on this problem space, maybe some of the hard lessons along the way. I think that's that could be powerful, and that could be a powerful way to raise money early on with a really great founder story. Where I tend to work with companies, it's at the point where they're now starting to kind of scale beyond the founder story into a real company story, right, or a brand story. And that story, again, is rooted, I think, less in the particular background of the founder and more rooted in the unique insights that the company has on their market.
Right. I'm referring to pretty much any story, like just signing up for a marathon. I believe humans are so soft nowadays, and most people don't have a story but create a false story most of the time or embellish a story that is not even interesting anymore. And I don't think that's what necessarily the market needs because you're promoting something that you're not ultimately. So that's sort of what I'm referring to.
Yeah, authenticity, right? At the heart of any story needs to be authenticity. It needs to be authentic. It needs to be credible, and it can't just be made out of thin air, and it can't be something that's just opportunistic, right? I sometimes differentiate between story and messaging, right? Messaging is very tactical. That messaging could look very different depending on, right, if you're writing on LinkedIn, if you're in a sales conversation, if you're running a campaign for a very specific audience. It still needs to be authentic, but it could be specific to a certain audience, to a certain context. Whereas the story itself really needs to be overarching and universal, so that you're telling the same story on your website, in your sales deck, in your PR. And again, that story needs to be rooted in something really tangible, right? Which is ultimately your positioning, right? What you do right now for your customers. But it could also be forward-looking, right? And also a little bit visionary. So I like to say that the story is sort of the sweet spot between, right, your positioning, which is what you do now, and your vision, which is where you're going, and that sort of bigger why behind what you're doing.
And you're a strategic storyteller. So how do you strategically adapt a story to the objective while keeping the authenticity?
Yeah, good question. I'm a believer that there's no one size fits all approach to storytelling. It does depend, to some degree on the company, on the objective. But I also think that there's a way to tell this overarching strategic story that is somewhat universal. And so I like to use a framework that I call CPSV. I asked my AI friend for a good mnemonic device for that. It came up with cheese pizza safety vest. But really what it stands for is context, problem, solution, vision. So the context is the context of your market, right? This is really about that why now, what's happening in your market space that makes what you do, relevant. That could be industry headwinds or industry tailwinds. That could just be what's top of mind for everybody, right? I talk about at the beginning of this podcast, I talked about AI being really the context that I'm working in, right? This world where AI has lowered the barrier of entry when it comes to storytelling. That's sort of the context that when people ask me, you're a storyteller, like they're like, okay, does an AI do that, right? Well, actually, AI has made it more important and more challenging to differentiate, right? So that gets into the problem, right? The problem is everybody sounds the same. It's harder to differentiate. It's hard to stand out in a crowded market. That leads into the solution, right? So what is the solution? What is that core positioning? What do you actually do, right? I talk about helping companies uncover their story, craft their story, and bring their story to market. So just getting really clear around the actual what of what you do. And then vision is where, like I said, I like to kind of end on this more aspirational, inspirational note. That's rooted in the bigger why. I find that when you're telling your strategic story, customers do want to know where you're going. They do want to know sort of what the bigger impact that you're having. And it's a bit of a flywheel because the vision leads back into your context, right? It's sort of your vision for how you're changing the context going forward. So that's sort of a framework that I like to use that I find can be applied for startups, for scale-ups, for larger companies. And obviously how you fill in those things is going to be very specific to your industry, very specific to your goals, as you like to say, as you said. But I think is a helpful framework for that overarching story.
And what is your story when you pitch clients, for example? Do you start with that on quote unquote sales calls? And also, do you modify that story depending on who you talk to?
Yeah, again, story messaging, right? The message will be a little bit different depending on who I'm talking to. I was at a conference last week. It was a startup conference for more early stage startups, and a lot of the conversations were around pitching, right? Pitching investors, VCs in particular. And so, a lot of these were one-on-one conversations or small group conversations. In that case, sometimes I actually led with more of a joke, right? Just to kind of get attention to break the ice. So often I say, I'm Dan Levy, not to be confused with Dan Levy, that other beloved Canadian, right? So that sort of breaks the ice. And then, I make from there go into, the framework that I just gave you. What's the context, right? So, I've been working in product marketing, content communications, tech for 15 years. And what I've learned, especially in the last year or so, AI has changed everything. AI has, made it harder and harder to stand out in crowded markets. but it's also created this opportunity for differentiation, blah, 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 right? So I do like to try to use my own framework, but adapt it to who I'm talking to what the context is. If I were to be, at a industry retail conference or a fintech conference, right, I might tweak it a little bit. But I do think that overarching story needs to be consistent to avoid confusing customers and investors and media, depending on who you're talking to. And that becomes especially important as you scale as a company and you've got salespeople right on the ground, and you've got your marketing team putting out content, and you've got your founder doing a keynote and a product launch. That story could get really diluted if it's not really clear from the top.
And should a marketing message always start with a story? For example, I run a cold email firm, and should I even start with the story? Like, I've been in this space for 10 years now. Should I start with that, or just get to the point knowing that my number of characters are limited in that little email box?
I think leading with again with the context, with the story of what's happening in your market is it's almost always really effective, because number one, it shows the person or the audience that you're communicating with that you understand their context, you understand what's top of mind for them. It shows empathy, and it captures their attention. Now, you might not want to spend tons of time there, but you kind of want to transition into more of the brass tacks, like what's the problem, what's the solution, pretty quickly. But I find by leading with the context, you're able to stand out, you're able to show empathy, and you're often able to grab attention. If you're doing cold, email outreach, an email sequence that might look a little bit different. Right? You might start with something more personal. I landed on your website and I noticed this, right? That's a common one. So I think, I think in almost every case, leading with, this is who I am, this is what I do, this is my solution, are you interested? Like, is going to be probably less successful than leading with a bit more of a narrative approach that starts a little bit high level around the context and the market and the problem space, rather than going right into the solution.
Interesting. Shifting topics here, how healthy is the startup community in Montreal right now?
Sorry, how healthy?
Compared to the rest of the world?
Yeah. I think Montreal has always had a really healthy early stage community. We've got lots of universities here. We've got some accelerators, a really good ecosystem of mentors. I was at this startup fest conference last week, and it's actually my third time at the event. My first time was maybe like almost 15 years ago. My second time was like 7 years ago. And this was my third time. And like, it's actually remarkably consistent, in a way that's, I think, really encouraging, that, we just have this constant, constant bench of talents and of energy coming into the startup scene. I think where it gets a bit challenging in Montreal in particular is scaling. Often at a certain point, companies either exit, or they maybe move to San Francisco, or they move right somewhere where it's a little bit easier to scale for a variety of reasons. But certainly early stage startups, I think Montreal is a great place to start a business.
Right. And you keep talking about AI and the wrong use of it to actually tell a story. Like, is there a specific prompt that you need to feed it? Also, knowing that it constantly forgets about your stories and your context. Like, how should I go with like having that AI tell that story in a different wording to different ICPs?
Yeah. Well, I think so. I think AI it could be super useful throughout the story process. I like to think of it in sort of 3 phases or 3 chapters. Right. The first one is finding the story, right? Like using AI to help you find and uncover that core differentiated story. That's where I see AI as almost like a research assistant, right? You still need to do a lot of the actual either in person or just one-on-one work of talking to the executive team, talking to customers, but then once you have sort of that raw input, right? The CEO is telling me this, the product person saying this customer is using this language. Using AI to kind of hone in on that core story could be really useful in the way that having a really good research assistant could be really useful. It's not a replacement for the kind of more experienced researcher, but it could certainly help them move more quickly. The second phase is crafting the story. So the actual story craft. That's where I see AI as like a staff writer almost. I started my career in journalism. I was an editor, and so I worked with a lot of writers. Some of them, more junior, talented, but not experts in the space. Needed a lot of mentorship, a lot of feedback. And that's where I sort of put on my editor hat and prompt the AI, with stuff like, one of my favorite prompts, actually, since you asked, is to ask the AI not to sound like AI, because I don't know about you. And I'm not talking about, trivial things like M dashes, which people on LinkedIn seem to be obsessed with. I'm talking about just like certain phrases, right? It's not just this, it's that, like certain sort of cliche phrasings that are just, to me, kind of sound good, but like don't really say anything. So I'll ask the AI to sort of weed out, get rid of the AI cliches, right? Get rid of, so I get to be sort of like a hard-nosed editor, being, prompting the AI to essentially, do better as a writer. And then, that third phase or chapter is bringing the story to market, right? Okay, now you've had that core story. How do you turn that into LinkedIn content and, website content and, sales collateral and even, maybe a customer success maturity model, right? Like across your go-to-market, there's like, to your point, there's that story is going to look and sound a little bit different, but you want it to be consistent and ladder up to that core story. That's where having that story is so useful, because you can say, here's my core story, right? And there's ways, of course, in like, having custom projects and Claude or ChatGPT or whatever you use, right? Here's the core story. You might want to input, here's the sort of brand style guide. Here's a framework that I'd like you to use. I actually saw people, after going through my framework at the startup conference last week, show me later on that they'd use my framework to prompt their AI, right? So once you have these frameworks, once you have the core story, once you have kind of done some brand and style guide work, getting AI to now help you translate that into different formats, different channels, could be really, really useful. You still have to edit, you still have to prompt. But at that phase, I see AI as almost like a peer, right? I mostly led product marketing, brand, content communications teams, but did some of my best work as an in-house marketer, kind of hand in glove with growth marketers and demand gen people and sales enablement people. So that's where, I see AI as sort of a peer. I get to say, here's the story, help me translate it into, this format or this channel or for this audience or for this industry. Could be super effective that way.
And who is a great example in terms of great stories in business? Like what individuals, and who's a bad example of how not to tell a story?
Oof. That's a tough question. A great example of storytelling in business. I mean, I think there's lots of great B2C examples. I think fewer great B2B examples. I think actually B2B has a lot to learn, from B2C. I work mostly with B2B companies, and what I try to do is help them elevate the story, right? To tell, a more, a kind of a bolder and more emotionally resonant story, because even in B2B, at the end of the day, you're selling to humans. And so I think if you could be really, really clear about who your buyer is and what their challenges are, both professionally and personally, right? Maybe they want to get ahead in their career, for example, right? You're selling to the business, but you're also selling to them as a buyer. I'm working with one B2B company in the sustainability software space, and that's an industry right now that's facing a lot of headwinds, right? There's a lot of backlash against sustainability, ESG, DEI. And the story that we put together for them was sort of counter to that. It's all this idea of kind of elevating sustainability, right? Elevating these sustainability practitioners within their enterprises, within their teams. And by elevating the practitioners, we're also elevating the work that they're doing and actually helping to mitigate risk within their business, helping to keep their business, more resilient and more sustainable, not on a variety of fronts. And by doing that, we're elevating their category as well. So that's sort of an example of a client that I'm working with. But I do think that there's a lot of opportunity for B2B brands to tell more kind of emotionally resonant stories. That's why I go back to this idea of winning hearts in markets, right? Ultimately, you want to win your market. You want to be the category leader. You want to drive more sales. You want to drive more growth, right? Everybody's saying that. But in order to do that, first you need to win hearts. You need to connect on an emotional level.
Yeah, Brian Chesky would be a good one. Reed Hastings, right? Like all these hustle stories from, or even Mark Benioff, I guess, with like end of software narrative.
Yeah, exactly.
And
The
not so good
software.
one. We would certainly have like Elon acquiring Twitter in the name of democracy, but just like stripping it off his assets, acquiring it, and the whole thing being a total lie,
Yeah, well,
Or
that's a
Zach,
great example of
like
of a story gone completely the other way. Yeah, I think a story that's more of an internal story that comes up a lot is Amazon's day one, right? This idea is more of a culture story that like every day should be day one. I think that's
the team, like
sorry.
sub narratives. The two pizza team
Yeah,
from Jeff Bezos. It's
yeah,
like a key concept to understand, and yeah, like people like it, right? Yeah,
yeah.
these are fun examples. Dan, thanks for coming on the podcast. Where can people find out more about you?
Yeah, so I guess easiest place is good old LinkedIn. Look me up at Dan J Levy, or you can follow my company page Storyline. You might be on there right now, so thank you for tuning in. My website danjlevy.com. You could read more about my approach, my sort of journalistic approach to story work, how I bridge the gap between core positioning work and go-to-market messaging. Website's not dead yet, so check out my website, check me out on LinkedIn. Also working on a book, but that'll take a little time to come to market, but I'll be sharing more about my journey that got me here throughout my career and how I developed my approach to storytelling based on my own experience working with and at brands like Unbounce and Zendesk and Ada and LivePerson.
So with Dan